Hi everyone, today I'm going to paint this lotus flower and I'm going to do something slightly different and do the entire thing in real time. Supplies for today: I've got a pencil and eraser, a very small detail brush size 0, silver black velvet round brushes in size 8 and 12, spray bottle, water, tissue for blotting, palette of paints and a palette for mixing. The paper I am using is Baohong 300 GSM cold press paper, and I'm going to tape it to the table. Because of the length of the painting section of this video, I'm going to start with the sketch already on the page. You can find the link to the free downloadable and traceable sketch by looking in the description box below or by going to my website, which is travelsketcher.net. I am going to use masking tape and tape my sketch directly onto my table. I am actually going to start with the background of the painting first, using a process called negative painting. Negative painting is basically painting the background first in a color that is quite a lot darker than the subject of the painting itself. I'm going to do quite an abstract and non-distinctive background using a mixture of greens. The reason I've chosen to start with the background first is that I often feel that the background is a source of anxiety for beginners. One often gets to the point of having done a really nice painting, and then we sit with the decision on firstly whether or not to do a background at all, and then a little bit worried that doing the background may mess up the painting that we've already just finished. So I think that a lot of that anxiety is removed if we get the background out of the way first. If I mess up the background or I don't like it, then all that I've lost is the time taken to do the sketching, and I can start again if I want to. To do this background, I'm going to use what is called the wet on wet technique. This involves that I put a layer of water down on my sketch first, and then I'm going to drop the paint into the already wet paper. So I'm going to shift between my size 8 and size 12 brushes. I will use the size 8 around the edge of the flower so that I stay within the lines, and then I will use the size 12 where the area is bigger and I can put a bit more water down. I'm using just plain clean water and laying water down in the entire background area. If I see that any of the areas that I've already put water down do start drying before I am finished, I'm happy to go in and drop a little bit more water into that area. You can see that the amount of water that I'm aiming for is to get the entire area wet, but not so much so that the water actually then starts running into the flower area. The whole area of the paper that I put the water down is glistening, but there's not pools of water forming anywhere on the surface of the paper. I have made the decision today to film this entire painting session in real time. I've done that with the intention of aiming this tutorial especially for beginners. I know that it may feel at the beginning that the subject is quite complicated and possibly unachievable if you are just starting out, but I feel that if we break it down into simple steps and deal with it layer by layer and section by section, that you will understand very clearly what it is that we are doing, and I think that it will be achievable for all levels. At the end of the day, watercolor is just the understanding of the different layers and the process by which we are going to achieve the final result. I will explain that step by step as we move through the painting today. I have started by activating my paints by spraying them with a water spray bottle. This process loosens up the paints a little bit inside the pans and makes them ready to transfer the color from there into my mixing palette. The brand of paints that I'm using today is Daniel Smith, but you can use any brand of paints that you've got at your disposal. For the green area, I'm going to use 3 different shades of green, starting with the lightest green first, which in my case is sap green. You can use this color or any light green color that is close to what I've got here. I have made the mix of sap green really watery in my palette, and I'm going to dot that around the painting randomly. So this is the process of wet on wet in action, whereby we're dropping our color into the already wet paper and allowing the color to blend naturally. Whilst this is still wet, I'm going to jump straight into what I would consider to be the medium green, and for that I'm going to use undersea green. I'm going to mix the undersea green with water and then drop it in around the painting, in and amongst the sap green that I've already laid down. I also want the greatest amount of contrast around the edge of the petals, so I'm going to put more undersea green around the petals than I did the sap green. Getting the wet on wet technique correct really comes down to having the correct balance of water control. Always make sure that any color that you drop into an already wet surface is less wet than the surface that is already down on the paper. So by that I mean, when I'm mixing the undersea green here, yes, I am mixing it with water in order to activate the color, but I'm not mixing it with so much water that it is wetter than the water that is already on the page. Dropping in paint or a mixture that is wetter than the page itself is the thing that causes the blooming effect or the cauliflower effect that you often get. Those hard edges are always formed because of putting something wetter down on the page than what is already there. I've laid down my initial bits and pieces of the undersea green randomly around the sketch, and now you will see that I'm going in and taking the same color in a thicker consistency and then dropping that in now so that I get a variation in the intensity of the undersea green around the sketch. I'm going to keep returning to the edges of the petals and making sure that I get some contrast there and dropping in the undersea green around that area. You can see that my paper is still definitely wet and that the color is still blending naturally as I drop it in on the paper. As the page gets drier and the consistency of the paint that I put down gets thicker, you will see that the darker color now blends less than it did when the water was really wet and when the consistency of my paint was quite a lot thinner than it is now. So there's still plenty of water on the page now that the color that I'm dropping in is still blending really nicely. You don't want to work in a panic in this layer for fear that the paper is going to dry, but if you're working on 100% cotton paper and you've put enough water down in the first phase, you will have plenty of time to be able to do this without it drying. If the color starts blending less than you would like, this does then mean that the paper is starting to get a little bit too dry, and I would at that stage rather stop, let it dry completely, and then come in again and wet it all over again and then continue adding in the additional color that you want to over the top. Now I'm going to mix up the third darkest green, and that is perylene green, and I'm going to dot that around, basically around the inside of the undersea green. I'm going to leave the sap green alone as much as I can in order to retain the contrast of the greens. So I'm going to leave the sap green and rather drop the perylene green in and around the areas that are already a little bit dark. My paper is a little bit drier now, and the paint is darker and of a slightly thicker consistency, so this color is now shifting less than the color did at the beginning, and that's what I want. I want these darker areas to start showing, and I'm going to also add this darker color around the petals as much as I can to keep pushing that darker contrast around the edge of the petals as much as I can. It is important to remember that firstly, watercolors are always going to dry at least 30% lighter than what you can see when you lay it down in the first place. And the more water that you are dropping your paint into, the lighter the color will dry, even more so than just naturally. I remember something that I heard a long time ago, and it constantly sticks in my mind, and that is a saying that says, if it looks right when it's wet, it's wrong. that obviously means that we know it's going to dry lighter than what we can see as soon as it goes down. So if it does look the right color when we've laid it down, it's not going to dry that color, and so therefore it's wrong. If we're wanting to get an idea of what it's going to look like when it's dry, we always want to be a little bit bolder and a little bit braver and put down a color that is slightly darker than the color that we'd like it to dry. We want this background to be dark. That will push the background and recede it into the background, so that the flower can come forward and be the subject of our greatest attention. And because of the blending that I can see happening here, I can see that I've still got plenty of time to continue adding more of the greens before it dries. So I've gone back to the undersea green here and adding in some more of the undersea green into some of those areas, because already I can see that it has blended out to be lighter than I would like. So I can keep shifting between perylene green and undersea green as I add more contrast to this background area. But I'm going to keep in mind that there are areas that I have got in sap green that I want to retain as light. So whilst I'm dropping in more darker color around the edges of the petals and in the background, I'm always aware of not adding anything to the lightest areas of the sap green and leaving those untouched. Rather to add more dark into the center of an area that is already dark and then leave the lighter areas alone. So as long as I've still got moisture on my page and I've still got blending of the colors as I drop them in, I'm going to just keep moving around this background, adding the darker colors in until they are a little bit darker than the color that I'd like them to dry. So I'm pretty much happy with where this is at right now for the background, and I'm going to make sure that I allow it to dry absolutely 100% completely before I work on the flower itself. To be absolutely sure, I'm going to leave it at least 20 to 30 minutes to make sure that it is completely dry before I carry on. You can see how much lighter that this has dried now, but I'm happy with that. This is how I wanted it to look. I'm going to start with these thinner lines that are on the flower, but first I want to lighten the pencils, so I'm going to run over the sketch with my kneadable eraser. This kneaded or kneadable eraser that I'm using here is a lot kinder on your paper than a traditional eraser would be. The cotton fibers of the 100% cotton paper can easily become damaged by an eraser if you go over it too harshly. I'm passing over this very lightly with the kneadable eraser, and this eraser doesn't cause any damage to the fibers in the paper. Now I'm going to spray my paints and prepare my first color, which is quinacridone magenta. If you don't have this color in your palette, then I would suggest either start with a pinkish red like quinacridone rose and add some darker purple to it, or vice versa. Start with some purple and then add some red to it until you get to this dark pinkish red color. I will use the wet on dry painting technique now, whereby I will have the wet paint on my brush and paint directly onto dry paper. I'm going to use my size 0 detail brush and start by painting the very thin lines that we can see on every petal. I'm doing this as my first layer because I've painted these flowers before, and I have sometimes done these lines as the final layer, thinking that I would do the blending underneath and the lines on top. But when I did that, it definitely could be seen that that was the final layer that I did, and the lines did look pretty much like they were on top of the painting. So for this painting, I'm going to do these lines first, and there's not any fear that the lines will smudge in later layers, because if I'm working on 100% cotton paper and I allow the layer to dry completely, then the lines won't smudge or blend when I put water and additional layers on top. But I find that the resulting effect is more realistic if I do this layer first. It's also really important that we follow the shape of the lines exactly as they are in the photograph. Our mind can play tricks on us a bit, and we can think that the lines curve in a different way that they actually do. I have given an indication of the curve of the lines in the provided sketch, so you can use that as a guide or looking at the photograph. But as you will see, I spend a long time on this layer just getting the direction of the lines correct and making sure that I get the lines as straight as I can. I really don't want to get any wiggle in the lines here, so if it makes you feel more confident, you can do light pencil lines first and then paint over them with your smaller brush. Also, what you will see I do in places is that I will do every second line and then come in and do the lines in between. It's important to keep the lines equal width apart and make sure that they don't touch each other. You also don't want to go in too hard or too dark with this particular color. It is a very staining and pigmented color, but I don't want it to be too dark. So make sure that your water paint ratio is correct, that the lines are the darkness that you want them to be. This layer is probably the layer that takes the longest amount of time, and I'm just going to play some music now because, as promised, I'm going to let this run in real time, particularly if you are following along with me. Right, so the long and tedious line drawing stage is over, and now the real fun can begin. Make sure that your painting is 100% dry. I've left this for about an hour and now come back into this layer that I'm doing now. I'm going to work wet and wet for this layer, and I start by putting clean water down onto this side of the petal that I'm going to work with. The quinacridone magenta that I worked with in the previous layer has now dried, so the consistency is thick, and I'll take that and drop it in along the edge of the petal. This layer really just is all about water control, making sure that the moisture that you've got on the page is enough that the color that you put in is going to blend, but not so much that the color that you drop in blends and fills the entire area of water. So I've gone and got a little bit of water on my brush and then tapped it off on the tissue paper, and now I'm using that damp brush to blend the color to make a gradient from dark to light along the edge of the petal. As long as there is still moisture on the page, I am able to shift and blend the colors as I want them to be. To get this to go to light at the bottom, I can rinse and dry off my brush in order to remove some of the pigment on it to get that blending that I'm looking for. I'm happy with the gradient from dark to light, but now I want to intensify the color along the tip, so I'm going to move to the size 0 brush again, load up my brush with the more concentrated pigments, and then put that in along the edge of the petal. There's still enough moisture in this area that when I put this darker color down, that it will still blend slightly out into the petal. You can see that despite the fact that I'm putting so much water in on this layer, that those thin lines that I put down in the first layer aren't shifting, and that is because of the 100% cotton paper and the fact that I've allowed it to dry. I'm going to work around the whole flower now, doing exactly the same effect on each of the petals as I did on the first one. But I'm always going to make sure that whatever petal I'm working on now is not immediately touching the one that I've just finished, so that I don't get any bleeding from one petal to the other. So I'll kind of do one and then skip one and then do the next one over. You will also see that I'm working on the sides of the petals that are in shadow. So these will be the darker sides. I will work on the lighter sides in the next layer. Another thing about those lines that we laid down in the first layer is, yes, they aren't smudging or blending as I'm putting the next layer on top, but you do see that they start to get a more natural look now that we're putting the blended layer on top of them. I'm going to zoom out slightly now so that you can see the full process that I use when I dip my brush into the water, when I dab it off slightly onto the tissue paper so that I can get the perfect water ratio on my page. The nice thing about this painting is that we are working in small sections at a time, so we don't have to worry about it drying before we're busy working with it. And we can really concentrate our attention section by section on getting the right amount of moisture and our water control, as well as our water to paint ratio. At any time, if you feel that you've got too much water on your page, you can rinse and dry off your brush on your tissue paper and then use that dry brush to lift some of the water or some of the color off of your page to get that perfect balance. So let's enjoy the process and work with each section of the petals one by one until we get the result that we're looking for. Let me discuss the brushes that I'm using in the painting today. The very small green-handled brush is a size 0 brush by Renaissance. This is just about the cheapest student brand of brushes that I can get in Thailand. I really don't think that the quality of the brush is really significant for something that is so small. You're dealing with so few bristles. As long as the bristles are of good quality and they are able to hold the paint, any brand in a small detail brush will do for me in a painting like this. Then the two bigger black handle brushes that I'm using are silver black velvet brushes. I would consider silver black velvet brushes to be in the mid-range of brushes as far as what one is able to pay for them is concerned. I saw so many artists using silver black velvet in YouTube videos that I went along and I bought some for myself. Because I got them when I was a real beginner, I was a little bit disappointed in the silver black velvet initially. I found that when I was a beginner, I rather liked brushes that had quite a firm snap to them, which means I was able to control the paint and where it went more on a painting. The silver black velvet brushes are quite soft compared to some other brands. But now that I've got used to the slightly softer nature of the silver black velvets, they really are my favorite brushes and the ones that I reach for first. But I think if you're looking for a brush that has got more of a snap to it, I hear that the Princeton snap brushes have a firmer tip to them. I haven't used them myself personally, but that is what I hear about them. I only used the silver black velvet size 12 brush in the very first layer when I was doing the green of the painting. For the rest of the time, the black handled brush that I'm using is the size 8 silver black velvet. So you will see me switching between the size 0 and the size 8. I'm going to work a little bit on this leaf now. I'm going to make up a very wet mix of perylene green and put that in first. I will cover the whole area of the leaf with this weak mix first, and then I will drop in some thicker consistency of undersea green. I will make it darkest up at the top and where the leaf meets the surface of the petal, and then blend it outwards. Once this darker green is down and whilst it is still wet, I will come in wet on wet with the quinacridone magenta and put that on the leaf as well, because the flower is casting a pinkish coloured shadow onto the leaf itself. I want to just put a little bit of yellow down in the little bit of yellow that I can see peeking out through between the petals. So I'm going to mix up some Hansa yellow light and then put that down in the yellow area of the petal. I just need to make sure that I allow this yellow to dry completely before working anywhere around it, because I don't want the yellow to bleed into the pink of the petals. I like to let certain areas of the painting dry before I carry on. I definitely don't want the side of my hand to smudge any of the work that I've done over the painting where I'm working. So I will stop from time to time to allow the painting to dry this far, have a cup of tea and just have a little bit of a break. But now I'm going to work on this petal that is facing us using the same techniques that I've used so far. I can see that there are sections of this petal that are quite dark, and there's also a little bit of a purple tinge to part of the petal because of the shadow that is being cast on it, and I'm going to have to think about how I'm going to address that as well. So as I've done in all of the previous petals so far, I've got clean water down first, and then I'm going in quite strong with the quinacridone magenta from the tip of the petal downwards. I will rinse and tap off my brush at regular intervals and then use the clean damp brush to blend the color downwards. I can see that the color is the darkest at the tip as well as to the right of the center, and so I'm going to darken those areas. And I will shift the paint around and blend it outwards until I'm happy. This really is the joy of working with 100% cotton paper, that as long as there's still moisture in the layer, you really can move things around, lift colors until you're getting the exact effect that you're looking for. I really want to push the tip of this petal even darker, so I'm going to come in with the size 0 brush and add in some thicker consistency pigment of the quinacridone magenta. I can see that I'm starting to run out of the pigments in my palette, so I'm just going to mix up more of the quinacridone magenta into this palette here. And then I will use the size 0 brush to drop in this thicker consistency pigment and use the small brush to blend as well. I know it's always going to dry lighter than what I'm putting down, so I'm brave enough to put it in with quite a thick consistency, just making sure that I blend the color downwards every single time that I put some more color in. Now I want to push this petal even darker at the tip, so I'm going to add some carbazole violet into my well, and whilst it's still wet I'm going to add that to the tip and then blend it in. I'm going to work on the stem now. I want it to end up being quite dark in contrast to the background, as you can see in the photograph. I'm going to start with a first layer of undersea green all over the stem in the same consistency. After I put that down, I'm going to let it dry completely before I come in for any darker layer. Now I'm going to work on the next darker green layer. I'm going to work wet and wet for this layer, so I'm going to put water down on my completely dry stem before I start. Then I'm going to mix up perylene green, and I don't often work directly from the palette, but I am going to do that in this layer. I really want to push my darker sections really dark here, so that is why I'm taking the paint directly from the well, so that I can keep the intensity as dark as I can. There is no discernible light direction in the photograph, but in my mind I'm going to have the light coming from the right. So I'm going to darken the left-hand side of the leaf and the stem, as well as the area directly underneath the petals, which will be in natural shadow. We really are nearing the end now. It's just time for some touch-ups on the stem and leaves. I'm going to add some shadow on the leaf on the right-hand side and then do a little bit of work on the yellow bit that's peeking out in the center of the flower. I really could have stopped the painting at this point. It is basically complete. But I just thought, having a look at it, that I really had only mainly used one color in the petals, and they are quite purplish, and that there is a pinkish undertone to the petals. So in some of the darker areas, I've decided to mix up some quinacridone rose just to add a little bit more dimension and variation of color in the petal itself. I'm not going to go crazy with it. I'm going to work wet and wet petal by petal and then just add in the quinacridone rose as a glowing highlight in places that I feel need it. I can't believe that we are finally here at the end of the painting. All that's left to do is to remove the masking tape. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate if you'd hit the like button, and I'd love some feedback in the comments section below. Until next time, bye for now.